worked. Yeah. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture by Jesse Obert. It is both presented with a small audience, but also broadcasted so that we can take advantage of the difficulties of the coronavirus period in order to reach a wider audience. So we'll start by listening to Jesse's presentation, and then people can either raise their hands and ask questions or make comments, or simply write their questions and comments, and I will address them to Jesse. Jesse is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. He's currently in the Institute of Mediterranean Studies as part of the exchange program that exists between the University of California and the IMS. And we are delighted to have him here and to listen to his paper on violence and state formation in Crete in the Age of Hoplite Warfare between 700 and 400 BC. Jesse, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And thanks for and thank you to everyone who has helped make this possible. I am very grateful to be here in Crete and having been working here and with the support of the American school and the German school and the Italian school, the British school and the French school. I've been able to actually go and see some of these objects, and I'm extremely grateful for that, as well as the Greek ministry. And the institutes on the right here are the ones from Berkeley that are supporting me and funding me while I'm here. So thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, everyone in the room for in the Zoom room for coming to hear me speak. So my title, Violence and State Formation on Crete in the Age of Hoplite Warfare. The Age of Hoplite Warfare is not my term. It's Anthony Snodgrass's term for this period from about late 8th century to the 4th century. He defines a hoplite as a hand-to-hand warrior, like this individual here. Hopefully you all can see my, my cursor. He defines a hoplite as an individual with a enclosed face helmet, or a bronze helmet, I should say, with a crest, a shield, and a spear. We are now sort of breaking that down further and sort of using more broad terms for what hoplite really means. And I think for me, it really just means a warrior that's doing hand-to-hand warfare or hand-to-hand combat of some form. The chronological range is specific. I've sort of trimmed a little bit, especially when I don't go fully into the 4th century, but that should be clear as I go further into my presentation, why exactly I've done that. The geographic focus on Crete, these 10 blue stars are the 10 cities that have evidence for violence in this period. The 3 red stars are the extra-urban sanctuaries that have evidence. And the extra-urban sanctuaries are pilgrimage sites where Cretan elites would have been meeting for semi-annual festivals and exchanging ideas and exchanging institutions and things like that. So I'm talking about Crete as a sort of broad collective, but we probably should be thinking about individual city-states as independent groups. The problem with this discussion of warfare is that the evidence is so scattered and dispersed throughout the island. Nonetheless, that's what I'll be talking about. The Palicastro in the east is still debated about what its exact status. I think the evidence suggests it's probably an extra-urban sanctuary, but it's worth sort of keeping that as an aside. So the purpose of my study ultimately is to fill a gap in our knowledge, and that gap has only been recently created. If we were to go back in time to the 1990s, the question of Cretan warfare would have been pretty easy to answer. We could just look at Plato's laws. At the beginning of the laws, one of the 3 speakers, it's an Athenian, a Cretan, and a Spartan. The Cretan says that Cretan warfare is about running rather than riding horses, since the land is uneven and more suitable for running by foot, that they use light arms and armor, and in particular bows and arrows, and that everything in the state is oriented around war. Everything in the polis is oriented around war. Glenn Morrow is probably our best, up until recently, was the most cited source on the value of the laws in terms of the historical text. And he believed that the laws was he believed that Plato knew Crete, that he had been to Crete, and that everything in the laws about Crete was probably accurate. More recently, there has been some reassessments of that idea. Josh Obert's recent lecture series at Berkeley, the Seder lectures in 2019, he sort of challenged us to think about Plato's works in the way that he was presenting them to the audience. And Obert argues that Plato often establishes a folk theory or sort of stereotypes about how people think, how his audience might have thought about some sort of question, and then proceeds to challenge that and turn it on its head over the course of the dialogue or the discussion. And in fact, that argument works very well for this particular passage, because immediately after Cleinias says that that's how the Cretans orient themselves and how they fight, the Athenian says, oh no, that's silly. Cretan states are not like that at all. Cretan polis are oriented around creating the best citizen rather than creating a sort of war-oriented community. And then at the end of or closer to the end of the dialogue, when the three speakers decide are discussing the sort of ideal Cretan city that they're going to establish, they very intentionally set aside archery and say that they're not going to give any prizes to it, and they're not going to really encourage it in any way. And instead, they're going to encourage hoplite, heavily armed, hand-to-hand combat, aristocratic warfare, and cavalry, which is quite the opposite of this sort of geographically deterministic description of the island at the beginning of the dialogue. So I think thinking about this as a folk theory that Plato meant for us to sort of fall into as a trap is worthwhile, but that also sort of opens up the question of what exactly is Cretan warfare. So we might turn to solve that problem. We might turn to the field of ancient Greek military history, but then we will be confronted very quickly with the Hoplite Orthodoxy debate. The cover here on this slide is from a recent book, 2013. I guess I should stop saying recent. The purpose of the book was to end the debate about the Hoplite Orthodoxy. But the editors set out in their introduction, sort of in the way that they talk about it, it's pretty clear that they really meant to reaffirm the orthodoxy rather than offer the revisionists an opportunity to really challenge it. They say that they wanted to test how well the orthodoxy holds up, to challenge revisionists to create a new paradigm for Greek warfare, broadly speaking. And they hoped that the revisionists would do nothing short of rewrite the history of the early Greek polis. The orthodoxy is really an argument based on the objects like this helmet, which is on the cover. This idea that the type of warfare that the ancient Greeks practiced was so encumbered and heavy and restrictive that the only way they could have done it is by working together in tightly knit groups, very heavily trained, and just pushing against each other, sort of like human battering rams. And that these sort of political changes that happened alongside the adoption of this type of warfare should be thought of in tandem. The most prominent Orthodox scholar is Victor Davis Hansen, the Orthodoxy is a 19th century idea that Hansen more recently in '89, brought back and gave new life. In his book, he really argues that democracy was forged on the battlefield and all these sorts of other ideas, and that men would push all together and men would die in the front by being crushed by the men behind them, these sorts of ideas, and that the shield itself had to protect the man to their left rather than themselves. And his argument is really more of a Greek exceptionalism idea, as the Greeks were better than everyone else in the Eastern Mediterranean. So this explains why they were, is because they tied warfare to politics. And if we sort of zoom out and look at Hansen's complete work, we can see, I think we can see how that idea is really being held out throughout. And his most recent books are about American exceptionalism and very neoconservative ideas about what it means to be an American. And that really is, you can see how much of that idea is in his older works if you start to think about it. The truth of the matter is that all of his evidence for his argument is very late, and he's using Hellenistic references to talk about the archaic period. And he's using sort of experimental archaeology or just reconstructive archaeology rather than real archaeology to talk about how the objects could have been used, how the helmets could have been used, how the shields could have been used. His work is still basically everywhere, and everyone cites it without really thinking about the implications of his work. And that being said, there have been some really important counter arguments against him, dating all the way back to the 60s, before he even was writing. But Hansen bases myths and realities. He very persuasively argues that the Orthodoxy is a myth, and it's not evident at all in the historical texts. More recently, Rolf Nijdiek's Classical Greek Tactics breaks apart the idea that hoplites were by any measure professional, and instead that they were amateurs, and we should think of them as such. And in the realm of archaeology, Anthony Snodgrass's book of 1964 showed that there really is no evidence for this sort of narrative of the Orthodoxy and the archaeological record. And instead, we need to be thinking about these objects as developing slowly over time and changing over time, and not sort of any one size fits all for ancient Greek warfare. In the realm of Cretan warfare, there have been some recent contributions that are very worthwhile, and there's a forthcoming article by David Lewis that was going to be addressing Cretan warfare specifically. Those are approaching it from the perspective, those forthcoming works are approaching it from the perspective of history, and my dissertation is very much approaching the problem of Cretan warfare from the perspective of archaeology. That's just because that's where I started. So in response to this idea that we need a paradigm, my argument is that the idea of approaching a problem like this and looking for a paradigm is problematic in the first place. And instead, what we need to do is think about smaller regions and how those smaller regions might build into a larger pattern over the Eastern Mediterranean. But trying to say that the whole of the Greek world fought in a specific way is going to be, I think, pointless. So maybe we can make another one of these Meta Bronze books at a later date. So the outline of my dissertation is to look at all of the evidence and use digital humanities to do so, just because of the scale of what I'm doing and the amount of evidence I have. And then I'm mapping the changes that I see in there alongside the political, economic, and institutional changes that we've already sort of outlined with the archaic and classical periods on Crete. I have, at this point, I have 871, I think, entries in my database, and quite a lot to say, but I have three major observations, which is going to be the focus of this presentation. The first is that the oft-cited line that Crete was in a state of internecine conflict and interpolity warfare actually has no good evidence for that argument. It's certainly possible, and I'm not trying to say that there was no interpolity warfare on Crete, but I think we need to stop and think about what we really do have in terms of evidence, because we're missing a lot. If we were to make that argument, we're missing the key parts of that argument. The second observation is that the Cretan archer narrative in the Hellenistic period, the later periods, Cretans were always called archers. And scholars have often sort of assumed that dated back into the archaic and classical periods. But that, I think, is a mirage that we're falling into based upon the nature of our evidence. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. And the final observation, which is going to be the real bulk of this presentation, is that the evidence for Cretan warfare reveals an elite masculine ideology rather than real violence, real organized violence, real evidence for warfare. And by elite, I mean actors who participate and hold social power. And by masculine, I mean the normate male idea of what a man should be according to art and figurines and things like that that are contemporary. So that in that last observation, I have 3 phases of this ideology that happens over the course of the 7th to 5th centuries. The first phase is what I'm calling the ideology of camaraderie. The second phase is the army of one mentality. And then the third phase, I've broken into 2 due to the nature of our evidence: income defense warfare in the first half, and then sovereign warrior aristocrats in the second. And this is just outlining what the rest of the presentation will be. So no worries if that doesn't make much sense. It is important, though, to stress that these 3 phases are not meant to be sort of monolithic blocks. There is a lot of bleed over and overlap between them. And they're really just meant to sort of outline what I think I'm seeing in the database evidence. Okay, so what does my database look like? This is a panel in my database. This is a little out of date. I have more than that. But on the left hand, we have all the metadata. We have a description. We have the chronological information. We have material information, context, location, etc. Everything in my database is going to be, if there is a museum link, it'll be plugged into museum link. If there's a Pleiades link, it'll be plugged into Pleiades, etc. And it's going to be published alongside my dissertation, minus the images because I do not have rights to all of them. But everything else will be published alongside my database online, or alongside my dissertation online. And then in the lower right, we have tags, and this is the means by which I'm doing all of my database analyses. So the idea here is I take an argument that someone has, for example, Hans van Baes's working classes versus leisure class hoplites. I take these ideas and then I test each entry in the database to see whether it can be used as evidence for that argument. If it can be used as evidence, then I provide a confidence coefficient out of 3 based on how confident I am that it does fit that argument. So this Mitra, which is a groin guard, it would have hung from the belt to protect the groin and maybe lower stomach area. This is an additional accessory. If a man is carrying a shield, it's an additional part that may not be necessary. And so it fits into Van Baes's argument for leisure class, guys who are take the time and money to invest in warfare and get all the bells and whistles and make themselves look really beautiful. So this is a highly decorated Mitra, very, very high quality. It would have checked, I think, very well Van Baes's argument for leisure class. So just to go through some of the other ones, the working class is the everyone else besides those wealthy guys, guys who are just bringing the minimum required equipment to the field. Cavalry is self-explanatory. Siloi is the ancient Greek term for light infantry or missile wielding individuals. It's a little vague, but that's why I use the word here in the database as well. Attendants are individuals carrying equipment into the battle for the warriors. Mercenaries, I think self-explanatory. Mounted hoplites is Peter Greenhall's argument about archaic and early classical warfare, where there are guys who ride up to the battle on horseback, dismount to fight on foot, and have their horses nearby in case they need to flee quickly. Epilectoi is a term from Xenophon. He uses this term to describe basically specialized troops that are given specific tasks on the battlefield. Go take a hill, go reinforce this part of the battle line, that sort of thing. Archers, self-explanatory. Orthodox hoplites, I've sort of talked about. These are the restrictions that Victor Davis Hansen uses in order to make his argument. So mobility, how weighed down the warrior is by his equipment. Audio restriction, how obstructed his ears are, whether he can hear commands or hear what's going on around him. Visual restriction, how much his peripheral vision is being obstructed. And I have 3 different types, either side and below or both side and below. Repairs to equipment, which I'm trying to track, and use, which I'm trying to track. So far, nothing much to say about this, but that might be more interesting in the future. The two main shield types that we have in this period, based on Anthony Snodgrass's shield typologies for archaic and classical warfare. And then tags having to do with how people are fighting. We really, in my periods, we really only have individual guys, and we don't actually have any battle scenes. So these tags didn't get hit at all so far, but they're still there in case something might happen with it. The idea with this is that this can be blown up into a larger project and other people can use these things. So we can always add more tags and go through each one as we move forward. Okay. So this is all of my evidence. This is the whole period. There's this big, most of our evidence comes from the 7th century, which is sort of what we might expect based on what people have already been saying about Cretan history and Cretan archaeological practices. And then we have this big drop in the 6th century. This is the archaic gap. This is also probably what we should have expected from this sort of assessment of the evidence. There's a lot of explanations for the archaic gap, and I have nothing really to contribute to that other than just to say that the evidence for violence is doing the same thing that the feasting and burial practices are doing in terms of archaeological patterns on the island. After the 6th century, it's really inscriptions, coins, and texts that we're looking at for the rest of this period. So as I said, I've broken it into 3 phases, and I'm using these I'll be using these orange and red lines throughout the course of my presentation as sort of markers of the 3 phases. The first phase ends, or I guess I should say phase 1 transitions into phase 2 right around the mid to late 7th century, which is when we have the destruction of the South Acropolis at Azoria and the construction of the public buildings there. We have the earliest inscription at Dreros, legal inscription at Dreros, and we have the beginning of the archaic gap at Knossos and the ending of the cemeteries. The phase 2 converts into phase 3 right around the late 6th century, which is when we have the beginning of this genre of inscriptions called the war booty regulations. The first one's at Axos, and then we have another one in the 5th century between Tylissos and Knossos. And then it becomes a real genre in the Hellenistic period. And this is the beginning this is the only evidence we have of any sort of institutionalization of organized violence on Crete in these periods. It's the only texts that mention warfare in any capacity. And as I'll talk about, it's only really concerned with how war booty is being brought into the community. And there's nothing about who they can fight, where they can fight. It's only about how it's being brought into the community. And I think that triggers the third and final phase for this period, for these periods. So here are all the different types of evidence I have. And I realize for those of us in the room, this might be kind of small. The votive miniatures is by far the largest category, followed by actual arms and armor, like spearheads, swords, Mitra, and arrowheads. There's a lot of interesting things in here in terms of when we might think of what type of warfare we're looking at, or how we're looking at warfare, from what perspective we're looking at warfare. But I think what's really significant is my first major observation is what we're missing from this list. We have no real evidence for perimortem wounds on any of our skeletons for this period. We don't have any good evidence for use of arms and armor. I'm finding a couple, but so far it seems pretty minor in terms of actual use on all these objects. We have no major defensive fortifications before 400. That might be a little neat. We have a little bit, but nothing substantial. In the epigraphic record, we don't have any mention of military alliances, casualty lists, military campaigns, war captives, things that we have on the mainland in Athenian inscriptions, or even in the Spartan war fund. We don't have any overt reference to warfare in the Cretan epigraphy, except for war booty, which I'll talk about And then finally, the texts that we do have that do mention any type of interstate or interpolity warfare on Crete before 400 are rather vague. We have a reference in Pindar, a reference in Herodotus to civil strife, but that might not be direct warfare. And then the one episode in Thucydides where the Athenians are participating in a raid of Kydonia is a little vague and weird and awkward, as if Thucydides himself doesn't know what to call it. So I think at this point we're going to be on shaky. We're going to be on, we'll use whatever cliche you want, but we're not on solid ground if we're going to make the argument that there is internecine conflict and interpolity warfare on the island before 400. I think we need to be a lot more careful with that idea because at this point we're looking at something rather different. We're looking at, I think, an ideology, an elite ideology, rather than real evidence of guys fighting for any sort of military or anything like that, any sort of organized violence by the standard definitions that archaeology would use. So one of the things I'm doing is visualizing my database using digital humanities and network analysis. So this might look really scary, but I'm going to go through it really carefully so that everyone can see what's going on here. This is my database. This is all of the entries, all 871. We're missing a lot because they floated away because they're not interconnected. What's going on here is that every dot is an entry. Every line between those dots is a relationship based on the tags that they have. So if something has no relationship to anything else, it just floats away. These are all created with Gephi, which is a free program that anyone can use. So hopefully we can all start using the same language and talk about these together. So this is how we might read one of these visualizations. If you imagine this arrowhead is this green dot, this bronze shield, omphalos type shield called the lion hunt shield is this whatever color that is, slight orange dot. This Mitra is this black dot, and this spearhead is this blue dot. So these two entries have evidence for archery. So there's a line between them, showing that there's a relationship between the two. These two have evidence for leisure class hoplites. There are these guys dressed head to toe in armor on this shield, as well as the shield itself, which implies some sort of very wealthy aristocratic type of warfare, guy who's investing a lot of time and money into violence. And so they have a relationship. These two have a relationship. This spearhead, we can't really say much about, unfortunately, at this point, at least with the tags that I have. So it's just gonna float away. It's not connected to anything at this point. So let's go back to the main database. And so what you do is you get that visualization, and then you need to figure out what each little cluster is. This cluster up here is the omphalos type shield. This cluster is the large round shield. And these we can basically ignore, I think, for now. We'll see how they play out when we have a more chronological focus on specific phases. But for now, we can sort of ignore these. The biggest bubble is leisure class hoplites. These aristocratic, wealthy warriors. And this bubble itself can be broken up into 4 parts based upon how restricted they are in terms of their equipment. And the main one, the biggest one, is heavily restricted ear, eye, and weight. And then we have a little bit of cavalry, but it's a little scattered and disconnected. And then we have another big cluster for archery. But you'll notice that the largest number of entries here are arrowheads. So we need to think about how the typology of the entries themselves is maybe skewing our evidence. Okay, so the most connected entries in my database are the texts, which might be sort of what we would imagine, these green dots here. They're holding everything together, specifically archery. They have the most evidence for anything. So I thought it'd be fun to just see what would happen if I deleted them from the visualization, and this is what we get. So this is the visualization of my database without any texts, textual evidence. So inscriptions, coins, everything you can see on the right, minus the texts. And what was really fascinating about doing this exercise is that you really get an emphasis on how weakly connected archery is to the rest of the evidence. while this is all sort of intensely interconnected, most of the archery evidence is being concentrated in these two dots here, which are the lion hunt shield and the tripod stand, both from Ida. Here they are, both from Ida, and both in the earlier part of the 7th century. You can see that they do have evidence for archery on them, so they hit the archery tag. I should say this is a fairly substantial bronze omphalos type shield found at Ida, at the extra-urban sanctuary of Ida. And this is a very fragmentary, but absolutely fascinating and must have cost a lot, tripod stand from Ida as well, a little bit earlier in the century than the lion hunt shield. So they have evidence of archery, but they also have evidence of perhaps more wealthy types of warfare, leisure class of warfare, sort of collaborative types of warfare, which would have required these guys all rowing to war together. Perhaps cavalry, though maybe not, but certainly hand-to-hand combat as well. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about these objects is that the archery that's being depicted here is, well, perhaps this is the lion hunt shield, but the lions are probably metaphorical in some regard, and we don't know who this guy's targeting with his bow and arrow. What's interesting here is that these are unique in the way that they're portraying archery, because archery, for the most part, in my database is about hunting. I used violence in my title because I'm including everything having to do with violence, including hunting. And when you just look at the evidence for archery over time, it's rather remarkable, or it is remarkable that hunting objects, hunting type arrows, these are the type 1, I think this is a 1D boss and barb type in Anthony Snodgrass's Typologies, which he says is the most likely to be related to hunting because of its very large size, heavy weight, high cost, and elongated cutting edge. When you're hunting an animal, you want to hit it once and not have it run away. So you need a big, heavy arrow, in theory. There's a lot of problems with that argument, but this is certainly the best candidate we have for a hunting type arrow head in the archaic period. And it appears all over the place in coins, and in the later periods, it varies explicitly tied to animals that were hunted. And so we have this, in the first part, we have these tons of arrowheads, and they're all of this type 1 Boston Park type. And then we have a ton of appliques from Katosime, which are these very explicitly about hunting. We have a guy carrying a leg here, probably a goat over his shoulder, and then another one here. This is a ram's head being carried. So we have this whole series of appliques that are about hunting. And then when we get another big uptick in archery, it's these coins that are also probably about hunting. So I decided to then, so I'll go back to the full database. This is everything again. And including the texts, I should say. And so what I did at this point is I just tried to remove the things related to hunting. So the arrowheads that are the hunting type, the coins that are associated with hunting animals, and the appliques that have game animals on them. And this is what we get with the database after we remove hunting, which, as you can see, archery dramatically decreases in size and is now very peripheral to the rest of the visualization. The leisure class hoplites bubble really becomes the focal point of all of our evidence. The texts fall into that cluster. This is the lion hunt shield, which is moved from down here all the way into the heart of the leisure class hoplites bubble. And in fact, it's situated between heavily encumbered and I think just audio-visual encumberment. And then that tripod stand has completely reoriented all the way around the leisure class hoplite bubble in order to be situated between the two shield types and leisure class hoplites. So this brings me to my second major observation, that I think what we're looking at when we're talking about archery in the archaic and classical periods is a mirage. I think that mirage is created by our evidence, in particular, our inability to distinguish between hunting and organized violence. There is certainly archery happening in military contexts and warfare contexts, but I think we need to be more careful with that. I think we need to think about what the word toxotes means in our ancient literature. And this argument has already been made quite substantially by Joshua Brouwers in his, I think, 2017 dissertation. He argues that the term probably means leisure-class hoplite rather than real archer, because he argues that archery would have required a lot of skill and practice. So it fits into that narrative. I don't necessarily agree 100% with that idea, but I think it's something we need to think about in terms of when we're interpreting that term in our sources. And I think for me, the most important part about this exercise of looking at archery and what it's doing is that the leisure class hoplites cluster is the primary focus of Cretan warfare. When we're talking about Cretan warfare, we're really talking about leisure class hoplites and how everything else orients around leisure class hoplites. It's about leisure class hoplites. It's about an elite approach to violence. So that brings me into the main part of my dissertation, which is going to be breaking apart these three phases. So this is the timeline from the introduction of the earliest hoplite armor on the island to Alexander's campaigns. We have that orange line, which I'm using to segregate the phase 1 and phase 2. And then we have that red line between phase 2 and phase 3. So in phase 1, as I said, I'm calling it the ideology of camaraderie. And the type of warriors I'm looking at are those that carrying omphalos type shields. In phase 2, I'm calling it the army of one mentality, and the warriors are wearing Mitra, the groin guards that are protecting their groins. And in phase 3, the first half is mainly based on the epigraphy. 3A is exclusively from the epigraphy. So I'm calling it income defense warfare. And in this phase 3B, it's mostly from the texts. So I'm calling it sovereign warrior aristocrats. And that whole period is oligopolistic warriors, as a reference to Vincent Gabrielson's oligopolistic violent state argument, which I think fits very well for Crete in the 5th century. And I'll talk about each of these phases individually right now. So this is phase 1. This is the visualization for phase 1. The omphalos type shield is the only major type. The large round shield is missing. We have our leisure class hoplites bubble. We have archery being a fairly substantial bubble, but you'll notice again that these are mostly arrowheads. And then we have this cluster here, which is just helmets that obstruct the ears. So no obstruction of vision, just ear obstruction, which is interesting. I should also say that I'm going to be talking about these phases in terms of chronology, but there's a huge problem with our chronology across the board when it comes to Cretan warfare. At Azoria, they found a phase 1, potentially late 8th century helmet and a early 5th century destruction level. So these things are probably continuing on, and there might be some contextual or spatial reason why certain phases have of the community. But that's just an aside, a problem that is going to be a problem for anyone doing this sort of study. So this is a closer look at what the phase 1 might mean, phase 1 warfare might mean. What's really significant here is, what I think is significant is how diverse our contexts are for this early phase. We have mortuary contexts, we have a little bit of mainland sanctuaries, we have a lot of urban sanctuary stuff and a lot of ex-urban sanctuary stuff. When we get into the later phases, the urban sanctuaries are going to completely dominate our evidence. Most of the stuff's coming from urban spaces in phase 2 and phase 3. The type of warfare that we see in this phase 1 is very collaborative. It's probably how I would describe it. We have these sort of images of men marching off to war together, a very common Attic base painting scene that only appears on Crete in this early phase. We have sort of images of guys standing shoulder to shoulder, fighting together. We have, again, this tripod stand where we have more collaborative types of warfare, rowing off to war together, relying on each other, and that sort of thing. The equipment of this period are these omphalos type shields that are one-handed, and things like swords, which require a little bit more skill in theory, as the argument goes, as well as the one-handed shield. People argue that that would have required more skill. So it's more of a skill-based elite type of warfare that where elites are relying on each other. And in general, I would characterize this as a elite collaboration in this early period. So this is how I imagine the warrior might have looked like. He's got maybe a tall crested helmet that maybe obstructs his ears, but does not obstruct his sight very much. As we can see in both of these images. This is the only period where we have any weapons. Certainly weapons continued into the next phases, but there's no weapons archaeologically attested after the late 7th century or after the 7th century. And I think a lot of the aspects of this panoply probably continue, as I say, but this is that phase 1 warrior, sort of light, elite, collaborative. So this is the phase 2, what I'm calling the army of one mentality. This is the main leisure class bubble that we sort of have seen consistently. Here are the large round shields. We do have the omphalos type, smaller one up here, but the large round one is now the dominating shield type. We have a closed-faced helmet, completely closed-faced helmet, mini cluster, I guess, peripheral cluster here, and cavalry suddenly appears in this period. Archery is there. It is only arrowheads, and it is all being connected to the rest through this one node, this one entry. And this is 2 plaques that join, one in the Ashmolean and one at the Requiem Museum, depicting this running archer from Chrysos from the mid-6th century. That's Boardman's dating, based on his attribution of this character as Heracles. We actually have a ton of these from Chrysos that are all 5th century, that are not considered Heracles. So I am tempted to think that this is a incorrect dating, but that's not my place at this point. I'm just collecting the evidence. So if we did take that away and we did redate this, then the archery cluster for the 2nd phase would just float away from the rest of the evidence. So here's some big graphs. This is the total of our evidence. And the rest of these lines are the types of warfare being depicted, or the evidence of the types of warfare that we have. And what I think is very interesting is that in the beginning of the phase 2, we have this sudden uptick in rather more expensive types of warfare. So suddenly we have cavalry, we have mounted hoplites, and we have attendants, which are the sort of aspects of a more leisure class type of approach to violence. Leisure class hoplites itself decreases in phase 2, but if you look at it as in terms of as a percentage of the whole, it actually gets closer to the total. So we actually have more evidence of leisure class hoplites as we get into phase 2 as a percentage. What I think is happening here is that violence and warfare, organized violence and warfare, is becoming monopolized by the elite class, or it's sort of being redefined as a wealthy only activity, that there's a buy-in cost to being a warrior. And so the types of warfare that are being depicted are those that require more initial capital to get involved. The helmets are also being more restrictive, and we can see this is the audio restriction. We have this sudden dramatic uptick in the obstruction of the ears in the beginning of the phase 2. And here we have the obstruction of the peripheral vision, whereas in phase 1, there's rather no restriction. At the beginning of phase 2, we have a dramatic uptick in complete restriction of both side and lower restriction. And I think that this black from Play Castro pretty accurately sums up what we're looking at. I'm calling this the Army of One mentality period because Army of One is a reference to the US military's slogan in the early 2000s. They tried encouraging people to join the military and selling military service by advertising military service as an individual activity where you go as an individual and you expand, you become an army of one. Whereas everyone knew that it was a teamwork-based type of warfare. You could not be a soldier in the US military without a lot of training, without working as in a team, and without collaboration. I think that aligns fairly well with what's going on in this phase two. They're advertising the individuality of a warrior. They're talking about how he can contribute to the battle, how he is sort of a juggernaut army of one. He's completely covered in armor. He's carrying really heavy equipment. He doesn't need his sight. He doesn't need the ability to hear. He just goes into battle and is a great warrior. Where in reality, I think we should expect that there were attendants helping them get to the battle, like this charioteer, and that they had individuals maybe standing behind them with more open helmets so that they could watch their back and make sure that they were okay. But the message that's going into the art and into the way that they're displaying this equipment is that it's an individualistic type of warfare where one man goes out and fights on his own. I think we can also think and talk about a redefinition of what the warrior means and warriorhood as we move into phase two. In phase one, we have these sorts of images where the torso is directly being obstructed by the shield, and on this sort of transitionary corselet from Frati, we can see how the shield just completely covers the torso. In a way, the warrior's torso is the shield. And so we can think about how that they're conflating warriorhood with perhaps his contribution or how he fights and how he defends the city, and use all the cliches you want. Whereas in phase two, it's a much greater focus on male anatomy and the normate male. This rib cage is one we see on male figurines all the time, this accentuation for this period, and the male chest muscles, and the groin guards, which become huge in phase two, and basically replace the shields in prevalence throughout our evidence. So while I think the phase one is about being an elite and how that elite contributes to the community, phase two is about being an elite and a male, or being a normate male, and how that individual contributes to the community. I'm not trying to say that shields disappear. This is a very frequently made point that I think needs to be reassessed. When we move away from the omphalos type and go into the large round shield type, we lose all of the shields because the omphalos types typically use bronze, and the large round shield types typically are made out of wood. So they're no longer detectable in the archaeological record. They are detectable in art, and we do have the large round shield continue into even the phase three. So we should be careful about how we talk about that. They were certainly heavier, they were certainly bigger, and perhaps they required less skill, as some people have argued about these types of shields. But just because Mitra become more prevalent in the archaeological record doesn't mean that the shields completely disappear. The Mitra are additional accessories to the shield, or should be thought of as such. A good way to think about this is that we also don't have any swords or spears after the first phase, but no one's arguing that they disappeared. So we shouldn't argue that the shields disappeared just because we don't have any of them archaeologically. So this is how I envision a phase two warrior. He had a very, not necessarily very heavy, because these are very light objects, or thin objects, I should say, but a very encompassing, restricting corselet made of bronze and covering both his chest and back. An enclosed helmet that would have obstructed his ears and his peripheral vision. A mitra, which would have sort of sat above his legs at his groin. Maybe ankle guards, maybe greaves. We have a couple of greaves, but they're a bit fragmentary and may not really be greaves, but maybe something protecting his lower legs, lower limbs, and then a very large shield, a large round shield type. This is a stele from Phineas, which I absolutely love. It's from this later, I think it's a phase 2 warrior that we're looking at. And I think, as Lambesi argues, I think this is a shield that we're looking at, sort of X-ray vision, because the artist wanted to emphasize his manly buttocks and his manly thighs and his chest and his military equipment, including his corselet. So the focus has shifted from the shield being a replacement of the torso again, and its contribution to the battlefield. Now we're interested in what makes him a man, what makes him a norming man. Let's see. So Gunnar Seelentag has recently argued that this late 7th century transition between where I'm marking phase 1 to phase 2 also marks the institutionalization, as he calls it, the institutionalization of elite competition. He argues based on the feasting and burial practices, he and others, I should say, argue based on the feasting and burial practices that elites move from more individualistic types of competition to a sort of group mentality where they avoid individualistic claims in order to emphasize group cohesion between the elite group and everyone else. As it might be, it might seem, it seems like warfare is doing the opposite of that. It moved from phase 1 being collaborative, a group sort of conversation, to a more individualistic emphasis on a warrior as an individual. But I think it still works within his argument, because these sorts of claims to individuality that I'm talking about in phase 2 are within the sort of broader context of warfare as being an elite-only wealthy activity. The fact that leisure class hoplites is our main source of evidence that there is no evidence for working class hoplites on Crete in these periods, I think would have been sort of a means of gatekeeping to make sure that only certain members could participate in this sort of competition, this realm of competition in terms of violence. And so there is individuality within that competition, but it's still sort of fitting the larger, broader arguments that Seelentag and others are making about establishing an us versus them competitive language from elites and everyone else. Okay. So perhaps the most, as I said, I think the most characteristic of this phase type of equipment is the Mitra. And these objects are very fascinating. There is some debate about what exactly they're doing because they're not attested in art. And I am perhaps leaving that open. I think growing guard is the best argument, as I've been saying, but there are others. I think we should think about these things in terms of identity crafting, because they fit so neatly into all the other evidence for what's happening in phase 2 in these periods between the late 7th and late 6th century. These inscriptions, which start appearing on Mitrae and other pieces of armor, they're on helmets and corselets as well, fit into this narrative. So they're all of the same formula. It's a name in the nominative, tonde hele, in some form, sometimes with apo, and hele is in Attic would be some form of hyreo. My Greek is the American Greek. I apologize to everyone in this room. But this sort of establishing the dedicator, and not even saying who it's for, and then talking about taking it away, lifting it, perhaps looting it, and emphasizing these sorts of actor-based approaches to this object is very significant, I think, in terms of how we're thinking about these objects in the relationship to the larger ideology of violence in these periods. And I think if we break it down in terms of Bourdieuian terms, I think we can say that a warrior takes his military power to the battlefield, converts that into economic power by looting the armor of an enemy, and then he takes that economic power back to the polis, back to the city, and dedicates it at the urban sanctuary, and then converts that economic power into social power or political power, perhaps, though our understanding of the relationship between the urban sanctuaries and the political spaces is still a little shaky this early in the archaic period. But this, I think what's happening here is, so this practice is mostly early to mid 6th century. And what I think is happening is that whereas phase 1 was about establishing eliteness, phase 2 is about establishing masculinity and eliteness and belonging. This practice of converting and showing your eliteness in the public space then moves us into the third phase, wherein the mechanism itself becomes the new ideology. So what this sort of quantification of status that's happening by dedicating these things becomes very central to the third phase of violence on Crete in these periods. So this is the visualization for the third phase. We have a little bit of a leader class. We have large round shields still. We have much larger archery because mostly because of our texts, but also all the coins that I talked about earlier. We have mercenaries appearing, and now epilectoi is at the heart of this visualization. You'll surely notice that there's a lot less entries here. This is that point after the archaic gap where we just have a lot less evidence. And perhaps we should be even more careful because of that. But epilectoi, I think, is probably the central focus for phase 3 in terms of what we're talking about. Although we have no archaeological evidence for the dedications, for those sorts of inscriptions on armor that are being put in urban sanctuaries, we still have references to dedications to temples in the epigraphic record. And so I think we should still think of that mechanism of converting martial power into economic power into social power as being still prevalent in these periods. And the war booty regulations are probably the best example of that, the one from Axos and then from Tylisos, Knossos, Argos. There's different versions, and it's a treaty between Tylisos and Knossos, whereas Argos as an arbitrator. These inscriptions they regulate how and where the booty is being brought in to the community, and how much can be put in certain temples. There's no rules about don't attack these guys or go do attack those other ones. Instead, it's strict regulations about how it's being brought in. And in the Tylisos, Knossos, and Argos treaty, it's actually paired with laws about trade and laws about property, perhaps leaving the community. So it seems like war booty is being conceived of, or I guess I should say violence is being conceived of in these ways as an economic activity that fits into, or I guess elite economic activity that fits into trade and property management. And it just so happens that this is also the period when coinage is spreading throughout the island in the late 6th century. The Aeginentan coin throughout the western part of Crete is becoming extremely popular. And Gorton is going to start minting in the early 5th century. And this institutionalization of property and inheritance is happening at Gorton as well, in the code and in the little code earlier. And so when I use the term income defense warfare, which is at the very top of this slide, I'm citing Jeffrey Winner's argument about oligarchy and how oligarchs operate in communities. And he argues that oligarchs will shift from defending their property or establishing property defenses into income defense once the community has institutionalized their hold over their property. And it works. There are lots of problems with his argument. He's taking a very broad panacea approach to history. But that particular part of his argument works pretty well for this final phase, this sort of 5th century violence in the 5th century on Crete, because we do have the institutionalization of property happening in a lot of communities, and at the same time we see this shift in the way that they're treating violence from establishing status to focusing on the income that violence would have produced. Let's see. So these plaques, I really like these plaques from Eastern Crete. There is a series. These are the 3 best preserved we have. We don't know exactly what's going on, but I think it fits phase 3 very well. We still have the sort of kit of the phase 2 warrior. We have this sort of normate male anatomical emphasis on his thighs and his male body. But there's a new added factor in this final phase, which is the sort of what he does with his violence, what he does with his masculinity. And it's going out to get a slave and bring it back to the community, or whoever we want to identify this individual as. But there is sort of you can see the pushback, I guess, that the individual has. This final phase 3, is reorienting around what you do with your masculinity and your status and your violence, rather than using it to establish yourself within the community, I think. Let's see. So these are the texts we have that have textual evidence for violence on Crete. There are 7 texts. They're all from Athenian sources. And archery is the largest number. They most often reference archery. But again, we sort of need to reassess what that might mean. And otherwise, it's a little bit all over the place. And so I think if we look at our textual sources, the best way to characterize the phase 3 type of violence happening on Crete is to characterize it as a versatile type of warfare, where we've got a little bit of everything. Maybe what we're looking at is epilectoi, guys who are doing specific things on the battlefield depending on the context of what that battle needs at that specific time. We have in the 5th century, we do have a lot of sort of mainland types of art. The Cretans are fitting into the larger Aegean world. And so it might be interesting to think about how these Athenians are struggling with a way to describe the Cretan warrior, because although the Cretans look like the rest of the Greek world and sort of fit into what it means to be Greek, they are doing something slightly different. And what's interesting as well in this is that we have a common denominator in all these, and that's looting. Almost 5 out of the 7 sources specifically mention Cretans as being obsessed with looting or focusing on looting as their primary motivation. In Xenophon's Hellenica, they even miss, I think it's the Siege of Argos, they even miss a great opportunity to kill a whole lot of cavalrymen and win a great victory because they left their posts in order to go loot. So there's this emphasis over and over again in our texts that the Cretans are obsessed with gathering wealth through violence. And so that fits already what we're talking about in terms of the ideology of violence. The 2 references that do not have any reference to looting, Aristophanes' Frogs and Plato's Republic, are rather indirect, quick, small references, just passing references. But it's still worth talking about that. So I think the phase 3 warrior is a sort of a building on what came before, on all the ideologies that led up to that point. We still have an emphasis on the anatomy of the male body, but now we have this sort of added factor of trying to prove what you do with that violence. And this silhouette is naked because we don't have any actual archaeological objects. We don't have any helmets, spears, swords, anything for this final phase, because we're deep in the gap at this point. So here are the 3 phases over time. And again, establishing eliteness and masculinity, and establishing eliteness, masculinity, and what you do with your violence as we build through time between the 3 phases. The ideology of camaraderie here, where men are working perhaps in unison or together in order to achieve goals. The ideology, or the army of one mentality, where there's a new focus on the individual and what he can do as a warrior. And then this sort of oligopolistic warrior who is using violence to acquire wealth for his community or himself and his community. Only a certain percentage was being actually distributed to the urban sanctuaries. And I think this is relevant to the larger questions about warfare. At the very beginning, I was saying that we need to think about, rather than thinking about a paradigm for the whole of the Greek world, we should be thinking about regional spaces and regional types of warfare and plug those into a larger, what's happening in the larger scale. So just to very briefly do that, The first evidence of Cretans in our texts fighting overseas or fighting beyond Crete is in the Sicilian expedition. There's 80 guys who fight with the Athenians, and they are considered rather important to the expedition, even though there's only 80 of them. We don't know exactly what they're doing, but they have a significant role despite their number. Then we have Xenophon's Anabasis, where there are 200, and Xenophon talks about them frequently as being so important to their survival as they're fleeing from Persia. And they are basically fighting as epilectoi at that point, doing specific tasks on the battlefield, going and taking specific hills. Xenophon's constantly calling on them to go achieve a certain objective. Then we have evidence of them at the Battle of Nemea fighting with the Spartans, and it seems like they have a very close relationship with the Spartans in the first quarter of the 4th century. And what I think is significant about these three examples is that we have potentially evidence of epilectoi fighting on the mainland, fighting in mainland armies 30, 40 years before the first accepted, established epilectoi group, which is the Theban Sacred Band. So what Cretan warfare might be doing is it might be introducing the rest of the Greek world to the concept of epilectoi within the army, and that the first epilectoi to fight for the Athenians and to fight for the Spartans might have been Cretans, perhaps mercenaries or allies or whatever else. So Cretan warfare, I think, is perhaps more of an ideology, more of a gradual process that developed over time. And I think it did have dramatic impacts on the rest of the Greek world, but we need to sort of be very careful about how we think about these terms and these ideas. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very stimulating paper. I think we can now open discussion. We already have one contribution from Zelina Harlaptis. Can you give me the mouse so that I can try to open?
Good morning to everybody. This is will be a question, as I am not a specialist on the period. But I have to say, it's more of a comment. I just want to thank Jesse very much for a very clear, systematic presentation. And as an economic historian, of course, I'm delighted to hear about, to see a use of relational databases, and of course, lots of diagrams, which, enlightened me as well a lot, and it gave me a very clear view of what is happening. And to my eyes, that was a very sort of also informative, analytic way of approaching history and archaeology, and it's thank you very much for this. I also want to say that Jesse is the second PhD student coming from University of California at Berkeley. It is after our agreement. It's a bilateral agreement between IMS and Berkeley, and we are very happy to have him here. Next time, we hope we have a larger group of PhD students in ancient history, and this is what we intend to do. So that's all for me, and I'm giving space now to the other participants. Thank you, Jesse.
I should just mention again that if anybody from the audience wants to ask a written question, they can do so, and we can. I can read the question to Jesse. Perhaps I can take advantage of my rights as the chair of the session to ask a few things. First thing, quantification is hugely important. And when somebody makes the effort to actually collect all the evidence, it changes the nature of the conversation, whether we agree on the interpretation or not. That's hugely significant. I mean, I had no idea that those plaques from Prassos existed. So just seeing them already changes quite a lot in how I think about these things. I knew of similar kind of depictions from southern Italy from the later classical period, but to see them on Crete is just amazing. Okay, so what I want to ask is this. To start with a factual question. The omphalos shields you showed to us, are they real or votives?
Yeah, they're most of the ones that we have are from votive contexts.
Okay.
And I think that they're probably not real. I think they're probably mostly all votives. I think when we think about votives, there's a difference between a votive miniature or a votive that is intentionally never meant to be used and a votive that could have been a real object. I think the size, shape, thickness of some of these.
So how big are they?
They're standard size.
Right.
They're real shield sizes. Most of them. There are a couple that might be more votive than others, but they look like real shields. I don't think they were ever used as real shields. But we do have lots of artistic depictions of them alongside perhaps like the tripod, but also those terracotta plaques that I was showing. So I think we should think of them still as a real thing, but certainly the ones that are the most beautiful are votives, I think, rather than.
Okay. Second thing, what impressed me is the emphasis you put on chains. Because there is a very strong tendency in Greek history to think of huge chronological periods and use evidence from different periods as if within those periods nothing ever changed. We might want to discuss your periodization, but I think what is important is that you bring so much focus in the fact that there must have been significant changes over the course of this 3 centuries. So I want to ask, you distinguish 3 different phases. And I think the emphasis you put that on the second period, different pieces of evidence shows a much higher emphasis on the individual warrior, the helmets, the visibility, blah, blah, blah. It seems to me quite convincing. What I was not quite certain is about the first phase when you stress the collaborative aspect. And I want to ask, what is the evidence that you use to stress the collaborative aspect?
Mostly based on context. The contexts for that period are a little bit all over the place, but they're within what we're seeing for the earlier periods, the early Iron Age, and the sort of elite realms of interaction, like the funerary context, but then also the extra-urban sanctuaries. And the weapons and the equipment are being paired alongside very beautiful pieces of art that show men fighting together. What's not in my database, but is directly before this period, directly before my phase 1, is the Fortezza belt, where there's a bunch of guys fighting side by side, all protecting a building. And then the quiver, which also has some images of men fighting shoulder to shoulder. Some of those motifs continue into my period, but it's only at the extra-urban sanctuaries that's happening. So I'm calling it this ideology of camaraderie because it's a sort of an extension of what was happening before, I think. And the little bit of evidence we do have of how these warriors are fighting, they're fighting shoulder to shoulder, they're in boats together and things like that. And I think the absence of that forever after is also significant. I mean, this is the only time we have any evidence of naval warfare on Crete is that tripod shield, or that tripod stand, sorry, which is fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, we have. Did we just lose Giovanni Salmeri? Yes, we have him, so let's give him, if I manage, that is, to open the microphone. Sorry, I can't see.
Yeah.
Wow.
Excellent.
Yes, this is not Giovanni Salmeri, it's Anna Lucia D'Agata, sorry. When I got the link and so.
Great to see you, Anna Lucia.
Hi, how are you? So, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this interesting lecture. And my comment is more a comment than the question. It goes what was said in the last question, actually. I mean, why do you start at the mid of the 8th and you don't go back to the 10th century? Because I think, you know, the creator from Sibrita can say exactly what you were explaining for your first phase. So why should we, let's say, create an artificial, perhaps, dividing between the two phases?
I think maybe next time I will expand a little bit further back. You're absolutely right. And their question, Kostas, was a great one. The initial reason why I didn't do it is because I'm trying to keep myself focused for the dissertation and actually get something done. And so I wanted to create some sort of parameter. My database is actually going to have everything for the first millennium. So I have all of the Aptera stuff already in my database. And I have all the stuff from earlier periods in the early Iron Age also in my database. And so my hope is that the database itself will be able to kickstart deeper discussions about perhaps what's happening in the 10th and 9th centuries, or what's happening in the 2nd and 3rd, or 3rd and 2nd and 1st centuries. But my focus, I guess, the real answer is because that's the parameters that Anthony Snodgrass set out, and I set myself up to just look at hoplite warfare, quote unquote. Obviously, there's some debate about whether the first phase is even hoplite warfare. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, there is a question from Irini Viltagnotti.
Thank you very much. So I'm not a specialist, but I will dare to ask a question. So I would like to ask, what do you mean by saying that Cretan archery is a mirage? So do you mean that you are not quite sure about how you could fit it in this reconstruction? Or do you mean that you think it is not as important as we have thought until now? And in either case, what kind of reconstruction of the Cretan toxotis you propose?
Great question. Thank you very much. I would say that the mirage part of it is, it is important, but the little bit of evidence we have is eclipsing everything else in the way that we're thinking about it. And that when we actually look at the evidence, it's rather minor. So it is there, but it's minor. And what we're mistaking for evidence of warfare is evidence of hunting being really important. So the mirage is the fact that we're not distinguishing between hunting and warfare. And of course, there is a lot of overlap between the two, but I think all of our evidence is pointing towards hunting being really important on Crete in these periods, not that archery they were actually fighting. And that we're taking that passage from Plato that says that they like bows and arrows and just assuming that that's what warfare was on the island. Hunting is super important, absolutely. But in terms of actual evidence for how the arrows are being used, the arrows are mostly hunting weapons. So in terms of what the word means in our texts, I think it's really interesting to think about who Plato would have been interacting with and who Aristotle would have been interacting with. And perhaps if we think about them interacting with the guys, the aristocratic warriors, the phase 3 warriors that were going to the mainland to fight with the Athenians and to fight with the Spartans, we can sort of see perhaps Joshua Brower's argument that toxotes, or my terrible Greek, but how that word was about leisure class or having the time to invest in sitting around practicing archery, or being like the Odysseus who strings the strongest bow and all those sorts of ideas, rather than a sort of lower class, effeminate Victor Davis Hansen talks about archery being an effeminate practice that the Greeks avoided because they didn't want to be perceived as women. That argument is not very well attested in the actual evidence, but it is certainly the case that archery was a leisurely thing to do that people would practice and play with the eye.
Have you thought of geography in the sense that if you live here and you have to climb on the mountains, you need to carry weapons that are not very heavy.
Yeah.
So what would you carry above all?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I mean that archery is not, I agree with the central idea, but it may be more than hunting in Crete because of the mountain.
Yeah, I certainly think it was used in warfare. And I'm not trying to say that it wasn't. I'm just arguing that going into it expecting to see archery has caused us to find archery as the primary means by which violence was committed. There is something to be said about the geographically deterministic idea of violence. But that being said, we often say the same thing about Sparta, that it's this really mountainous place where they, or other parts of the Peloponnese, and they don't have archery as much as Crete. So, why is that the case? Actually, interestingly, most of our cavalry evidence comes from Cortina, which is a major plain on Crete. So we can start getting into the nuances of exactly what's going on where. Well, yeah, there's something to be said there, absolutely. But going into it expecting one thing, of course, you're going to find that thing. So.
But I suppose that you are aware of descriptions of travelers from the 17th century describing Cretans dancing with their arrows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think archery was, and hunting specifically, was more important to the Cretans than a lot of other mainland communities. Absolutely. And I think that the Cretans that were going abroad, especially in the Anabasis, they're carrying bows with arrows with them the whole time. They're also carrying shields, large bronze shields in the Anabasis, and they're also fighting hand to hand. So we need to sort of look at the whole picture rather than saying, "Oh, look, they've got bows and arrows. Let's not talk about them. They're archers." Like, well, no. In the Anabasis, in the next passage, they're fighting hand to hand. So we need to think about the whole thing rather than just archery. Thank you.
Yes, there is a written question as well from Sarah. Apologies in advance. I realize I should see my optician relatively soon if I don't read it properly. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering whether the database has a function to distinguish between imports and locally made objects. In particular, I was wondering how you take into account Cretan uses of orientalizing motives of violence / warfare, such as the lion hunt shield that may be coming from the Near East and thus may not be wholly representative of native practices of violence.
Yeah, that's a very good question that I need to address. There is no import versus local entry tag, I should say, in my database yet. That might be something I should add. It's definitely something I should add. In terms of how much the orientalizing, a term I'm trying not to use as much, the Near Eastern influencing patterns in terms of art and how violence might have played in Crete. I think it's very interesting, and I think even the omphalos type itself is probably a Arturian type before it comes to Crete, but it's still here, and it should be talked about as a Cretan thing, I think, rather than a sort of exclusively exterior thing. There's a lot to be said about how the Eastern influences in art are being adapted to Cretan styles or mainland styles, and that Cretan art is a sort of hybrid between mainland Greek and Eastern art. And I think that we can probably say the same thing about warfare, that it's not necessarily a direct copy of Near Eastern practices, but instead of a sort of adaptation and hybridization with what's going on in the mainland. So I absolutely, I thank you very much. I definitely am going to add an import versus locally made category for questions like that. But I don't necessarily think that we should consider things like the Lion Hunt Shield as Near Eastern more than Cretan. I think they're Cretan.
Okay, we have another question from Kostas Vadelos.
First, thank you very much for the announcement. It was very stimulating.
So that they can hear you.
So, I have a couple of questions. The first, of course, for archery. What else? I wonder, do the archaeological evidence, the arrowheads, essentially, tells us that archery in Crete was more important than in mainland Greece? I mean, do we find more arrowheads in Greece than in Peloponnese or mainland Greece? Because I suppose that we were hunting there too. Your hunting was not just in Crete. And a comment, I was thinking that the arrow was not just a tool for hunters, apart from war, of course. It was a tool for shepherds too. So could we think of archery as connected to shepherds and stuff like this? Do we have archaeological evidence of that kind of stuff for mainland Greece, for example? And the third thing I would like to share with you, essentially, concerning archery. Archery, for whatever purpose, requires a certain amount of expertise. So I suppose that it was not hunting or shepherds or staff were not all elites. I suppose it was activities that were spanning across the society. So I suppose archaeological evidence, apart from arrowheads, eludes that spanning of the use of bow. That's for archery. So it was very interesting. Concerning now the warrior of the third phase, of your third phase, I wonder if you understand him as an all-around warrior vis-a-vis a medieval knight that has his kit, his war kit, more or less conceived like a medieval armor, an all-around warrior for all-around purpose. And archery is a part of this kind of stuff. More or less that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your questions. To answer your first question, in 1967, I believe, when Anthony Snodgrass wrote his Arms and Armor of the Greeks, he comments that there seem to be more arrowheads on Crete of the Cretan type than the whole of the rest of Greece combined. And he even suggests that the type 1 is a Cretan type that when we find in other places are Cretans going abroad. He suggests that and then throws it away because he thinks that would not be very likely, and that instead it just may be a very popular type here on Crete that then is expanded out. And so the type 1 is the one that's the very broad, very heavy, very expensive to produce type, much more expensive than the other types, I should say. So yeah, absolutely, Crete has more evidence for archery in terms of just pure arrowheads, numbers of arrowheads. At least in the 60s, it had more evidence of pure numbers than anywhere else on the mainland. Though I think surely archery was happening on the mainland and there's a lot to be. I did my master's about a little bit about archery and Attic art, so there's tons of archers in that as well. I did not consider shepherds. That's a really, really good point about shepherds using bows and arrows too. And that's I'm gonna totally take that I'm going to use that now. That's a very, very good point that I had not thought of at all. And I don't think Snodgrass talks about that at all either, which is fascinating. But I think absolutely you're right. That's a very realistic way of thinking about archery. I don't necessarily at this point want to say that there are more shepherds on Crete than anywhere else, though certainly shepherding is extremely important on Crete to how Cretans were identifying and organizing themselves in my periods. And then in terms of the phase 3, like I'm a medieval knight, that is sort of how I'm thinking about it. Though I maybe don't want to emphasize the sort of wealth, aristocraticness of the, not to the level of the knight. I think that they were elites within their community, but not, and that there were sort of capital buy-in costs associated with violence within the community that sort of gatekeeped and protected, made it an elite activity. But I think there's too much emphasis to say that they're this aristocratic class, aristocratic warriors. And I think that line might not be as high in the wealth bracket as we maybe want it to be. And so I'm intentionally trying to keep it a little vague because I don't really want to commit myself to the already very often talked about sort of elite only type of warfare, or not elite only, but like 1% only type of warfare. Though I do think they were as versatile as a medieval knight. So they did certainly have a lot of expertise in a lot of different types of warfare, and they seem to come prepared for when they go on the Anabasis and when they're fighting with the Athenians and the 420s or the 410s. They seem to be prepared for anything that could come at them. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, is there any other question from the digital audience or comment? Okay, is there any other question from the live audience? Well, in that case, I think we should thank Jesse for this very fascinating paper, which will generate a big discussion because quantification of the evidence like you have done and attempts to interpret it in a chronological periodization like you did is of utmost importance. I'm sure other people will follow what you have done, and let's hope that we'll see the published version of what you talked to us today fairly soon. It will make a significant contribution to the study of Greek military history, but it will also make a significant contribution to the study of the history and archaeology of Hansen Crete. So thank you very much for this splendid presentation. Thank you all, both those present in body and those present in spirit, for your participation and questions. Thank you very much.
May I add too, as well, to thank Jesse for his always kind and nice presence in Kalaoda, where he is now, and he survived the partial isolation of COVID and of getting people together, getting people apart, and everything. And we look forward for your thesis and publication of your thesis and the presentation in our big lecture room with lots and lots and lots of people. Okay. This is you're going back in this next week or in a few days.
Yeah, a couple weeks. Yeah, probably.
Couple weeks. Okay, so I'll see you shortly then. So. Thank you very much again from my part too, and we all enjoyed your lecture. Thank you.
Now what?
What do we do now? Let's